A few minutes ago, you said you'd like a gender definition of domestic abuse. I completely understand that everybody acknowledges that the overwhelming number of victims of domestic abuse are women, and that's tragic. But do you not worry that in doing that we'd actually overlook and then possibly leave behind some male sufferers of domestic abuse?
While the country's been on lockdown and various government ministers have been encouraging anyone and everyone experiencing domestic violence to call a publicly funded national domestic violence helpline that doesn't actually offer help to men, the domestic abuse bill has been slowly but surely making its way through Parliament, with the help of a cross-party parliamentary public bills committee who have held a number of meetings in recent weeks. Now, in truth, I haven't been following their progress particularly closely for a number of reasons, partly due to time constraints and commitments to other work, but also because, if I'm being entirely honest, I'm not certain I could stomach watching MPs from across the political spectrum repeatedly misdirect and frankly mislead Parliament with the following much muttered mantra.
The overwhelming number of victims of domestic abuse are women, and that's tragic.
All while various self-identifying champions of equality deign to speak on behalf of vulnerable victims and prevaricate about how this particular class of people should be perceived very differently depending solely on their sex. A sad reality that goes quite a long way to explaining why, according to the Mankind Initiative, female victims were mentioned 75 times during the first meeting of the committee, compared to male victims who got 5 mentions, 3 of which were to minimise or undermine their experience. It explains why during the second meeting, for every 30 mentions of female victims, male victims were acknowledged only once. And once again, 1 out of their 2 solitary mentions was specifically used to downplay their existence. And it explains why, again, according to the Mankind Initiative, who asked to give evidence to the committee, no charities of male victims were invited to attend, while a grand total of 7 representing female victims lined up to offer the committee their apparently expert advice. That all being said, happily, some stakeholders have been following matters more closely, and one of them asked me to comment on the response to a specific question about male victims that came at the very end of the meeting held on the 4th of June. So I'm just going to go ahead and play the segment in question, and then I'll say my piece.
A few minutes ago, you said you'd like a gender definition of domestic abuse. I completely understand that everybody acknowledges that the overwhelming number of victims of domestic abuse are women, and that's tragic. But do you not worry that in doing that we'd actually overlook and then possibly leave behind some male sufferers of domestic abuse?
I think it is possible to provide a gendered analysis of domestic abuse whilst also recognising that men, there are circumstances in which men also face abuse. I don't think that the two need be mutually exclusive. I think it is possible in the way in which we draft the bill, the way in which we talk about the fact that it applies to many groups in society, but overwhelming victims are women, that it should necessarily do what you fear might happen.
So, for the uninitiated, that was Pragna Patel, director of Southall Black Sisters, responding to a question from Scottish Conservative MP Andrew Bowie, who, as you'll probably have noticed, somewhat poisoned the well on behalf of male victims by preceding his question with the predictable mantra that the overwhelming majority of victims are in fact female. And despite entirely bending the knee to the gendered construct, given that he did go on to express concern that male victims may possibly be somewhat overlooked, I can't help thinking that certain people around the table were secretly thinking something similar to this.
It happens to men too, It
happens to men.
Do you want to point? It happens to men as well. Oh, yeah, okay.
Now, obviously the phrase overwhelming majority is a subjective statement. However, as the UK Statistics Agency have helpfully acknowledged, in the context of discussions about a bill that its sponsors have repeatedly claimed is urgently needed to help the approximately 2 million adults in England and Wales who experience domestic violence every year, Given that roughly 1/3 of those 2 million adults are understood to be male, its use may imply that a larger proportion of victims are female than the statistics consistently show. And roughly 50% of the children who witness or experience domestic violence will also be male. Children who were discussed quite a lot during this session, particularly in relation to the postcode lottery for specialist services that people around the UK currently face.
So just quickly to pick up the issue of that sort of postcode lottery, that it's potentially not it's not harmed in the bill, but it's not catered for in the bill. So just for example, in the situation where a child is a victim of domestic abuse, either directly themselves or they are living every day with their mother being raped, beaten, abused in front of them, are you confident that if that child were to come forward, that there would be specialist support or any support for that child, no matter where they stood up in the country?
No, and that's probably where the biggest, children and also services that help perpetrators to change are probably the biggest areas where there are gaps in our system.
That was the recently appointed Domestic Violence Commissioner, apparently for all victims of domestic violence, identifying perpetrator programs almost exclusively aimed at men as a bigger gap in the current system than the stark postcode lottery currently experienced by male victims when seeking help from a largely state-funded sector, most of which is exclusively staffed by women who appear entirely comfortable with the concept of essentially cutting male victims loose. Which, in my humble subjective opinion, is one of the two central reasons why people like Pragna and Patel are so obsessed with pushing and, let's face it, policing the concept of gendered crime. With the other reason, obviously enough, being that it provides a justification argument for anyone accused of promoting damaging stereotypes about people with protected characteristics based solely on their sex.
It happens to men too, you know. Do you want
The
a point? It happens to men as well.
men's.
Oh,
Men's.
yeah, okay.
Anyway, I've debunked the 5 principal pillars of the gendered violence construct in a previous video. So today I thought it might be an interesting thought experiment to take Ms. Patel at her word and consider the potential implications for minority victims. If Parliament were to accept, as they very much appear to do, that the majority of victims are overwhelmingly female, and that it therefore logically follows that domestic violence should be treated as a gendered crime. Because to a large extent, Ms. Patel found herself in the position to address at least one committee member's concern about minority male victims, because she had been invited to give evidence specifically on behalf of another minority group, specifically Asian women living in London. Other minority groups given a voice in front of the committee have been the Latin American Women's Rights Service, Migrant Women UK, Welsh Women's Aid, Step Up, Hestia, and Salia Rashid, who appears to have been the only person in attendance specifically speaking on behalf of disabled people, or probably more realistically, disabled women. And just to give a full idea of how heavily the committee have loaded the deck in favour of the gendered violence construct, and why they couldn't squeeze in an appearance from people like the Mankind Initiative, the committee has also heard evidence from Women's Aid, Refuge, Safe Lives, the End Violence Against Women Coalition, and the Commissioner for Victims and the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, 2 public servants paid handsomely out of the public purse who, as I've highlighted in previous videos, are both very much welded to the gendered violence framework. Significantly, no one was invited to specifically represent the interests, diverse and specialist needs of the LGBT community, which on the one hand struck me as surprising because domestic violence champions like Jess Phillips are always talking about cuts to specialist services and its impact on minority groups, with one obvious exception. But then again, as J.K. Rowling helped to highlight this week, there is a bit of a turf war going on between people with similar views to many of those in attendance, and members of the transgender community. A debate that does kind of run a coach and horses straight through their carefully crafted gender-exclusive narrative. So perhaps that's why the LGBT community didn't make the list. So never mind asking that tiresome question, what about the estimated 6 to 8% of the UK population who are LGB or T? And even more specifically, what about minority people within this minority, such as people who self-identify as pansexual? Pansexual people like the MP for Oxford West and the potential next leader of the Liberal Democrats, Layla Moran. For the uninitiated, Moran came out as pansexual at the start of the year and gave a number of media interviews explaining what that meant.
Was it Pink News or the Daily Mail that you did an interview with? And
it was both, yeah.
You talked about a new relationship with a woman, and you described yourself as a pansexual, which was something that I'd never heard of before. Just explain to our listeners how you define that.
How I define that. And I think, first of all, it's the person that I'm attracted to. And their physical attributes, male, female, other, doesn't matter to me. It's how you click and how you get on in their personality. And I realised that at some point I was going to talk about this, probably. So you go on, as you do when you're sort of having these moments of, gosh, this is a new facet to me that I didn't know about. And you look at these different definitions online, and pansexual was the one that seemed to resonate most with me, which is that it's an attraction to the person regardless of anything else.
Because a lot of people would say, well, actually, it's bisexual. What's the difference between being a bisexual and a pansexual?
Well, I suppose it's just recognising, first of all, the fact that the gender aspect of it to me is not that important. And there are people who are gender non-conformist, they're, perhaps intersex, there could be, it doesn't really matter to me, that stuff. And it opens the door to, well, it's a woman, but maybe it's another gender, it doesn't really matter. So it's a more sort of all-encompassing, inclusive definition.
Some reactions to her statements were somewhat on the cynical side, not least because she admitted that she had rushed out a statement on her private life, specifically because the Daily Mail were about to report that she was in a relationship with the Liberal Democrats' disgraced former head of public relations, who resigned under a cloud in the middle of the previous month's general election. Her critics may very well have a point, but personally, I would question her sincerity and her credibility as a positive role model for the pansexual community for entirely different reasons. Because Layla Moran's proposed pansexual worldview, that she sees the person first and foremost over and above their sex, strikes me as staggeringly similar to a principle that people like me have been championing for a very long time. It's not ordinarily something that most of us apply in our love lives, but I would argue that it is clearly one of the bedrock principles embraced by anyone who sincerely believes in the basic concept of gender equality. Gender equality including equality of opportunity and equality before the law when it comes to access to goods and services, and crucially equality of regard and consideration towards types of people paid by people in Parliament who we all trust to make fair laws. The sort of gender equality that every single MP, including the entire Domestic Abuse Bill Committee, have sworn to uphold. And yet, judging by their performance, in my humble subjective opinion, they're not upholding it very well. And people, or more particularly MPs like Layla Moran, have yet to stand up and point out that when it comes to supporting vulnerable people, surely we must see them as people first and foremost before any other thing. If for no other reason than it's required by the law. And what's more, MPs like Layla Moran have yet to signal any support towards Philip Davis's proposed amendment, which would mean that the bill would recognise explicitly that domestic violence can affect anyone regardless of their sex. Although, as William Collins has highlighted in his blog The Illustrated Empathy Gap, She has put her name to a number of dubious and potentially draconian proposed additions, including the proposal that in any homicide which includes injuries arising from domestic abuse, even if those injuries were not the cause of death, then a charge of murder will be obligatory, meaning that neither a charge or a plea of manslaughter will be permitted, and that each police force shall be responsible for ensuring that anyone convicted of an offence that amounts to domestic abuse must notify relevant police forces within 14 days if they commence a new sexual or romantic relationship. A failure to notify the police shall be an offence liable on conviction to a term of imprisonment not exceeding 12 months. A potential law that, based on the law of averages and various metrics concerned with the possibility of repeat offending, could have significant implications specifically for people like Layla Moran. Because as regular viewers of The Glass Blind Spot will probably be aware, Layla Moran has been a perpetrator of domestic abuse. In a previous video I covered her confession and the extraordinarily positive reaction of her party colleagues, and since then she has discussed the incident in slightly more detail in an exclusive interview with The Times. Moran has described the incident, which led to her being arrested, detained overnight and subsequently charged with assault, as neither her or her ex-partner's finest hour, and her perspective on the matter certainly makes the victim-perpetrator dynamic somewhat less than clear. She claims that she and her former partner, Richard Davies, touched each other in anger during an argument over the breakdown of their relationship, and more specifically she hit him in an act of defence because, and I quote, she felt threatened. Davies was initially also arrested as a possible perpetrator of domestic violence. However, he was subsequently released and only Moran was charged with an assault that she fully accepts that she did. She then appeared in court, at which point the charges were eventually dropped. A situation which struck me as significantly similar to a scenario that Ms. Patel presented to the committee in support of her perception that women are overwhelmingly the victims of domestic abuse.
The disadvantage of not making it gendered is that, and I've seen this in our local area, in the way in which statistics are then gathered and skewed. Let me give you an example, if I may, if I've got a minute. When a woman reports a domestic abuse and the police turn up at the door, the perpetrator usually makes a counter-allegation and says, well, actually, it was her abusing me. The police feel that they can't judge who is the victim here and who is the perpetrator. And what they've done, and we've seen this in a number of our cases, is that they either label both perpetrators or they label both victims. And there have been circumstances when the victim herself has been labelled the perpetrator and arrested and charged. Now, what that then means is that the statistics that are gathered locally are skewed because it suggests that more men are victims of domestic abuse than they are. And in all these cases where women have been categorised as perpetrators, by the time they've got to court, those charges have been dropped because the context has been interrogated and it's been seen that actually they were the victims. And so what I'm saying is that then skews statistics. It then skews the policies that are needed to deal with abuse and skews policies that are needed to deal with particularly prevention and who the target audiences should be. So I think it's dangerous not to reflect what is a social reality, what is a global reality, and what is recognised in other UN laws, in international human rights law, under CEDAW, in the Istanbul Convention itself, that domestic abuse is gendered. It doesn't mean, therefore, that we can't accept that abuse also occurs towards men and make sure that there are also protective measures to deal with that.
Both parties were initially arrested, both appeared to have blamed each other, and when the woman appeared in front of the court, the charges were eventually dropped. But then again, statistically speaking, her male partner might not have got off so lightly, because in this example, the accused was in fact a self-confessed perpetrator of domestic violence, who apologised to the court for her actions. So I guess my point is that Ms. Patel's perspective will be somewhat skewed given that her experience is exclusively limited to exclusively helping female victims of domestic abuse. And presumably had an expert witness with any experience whatsoever of the experience of male victims been asked the same question, presumably they would have described relatively similar scenarios, because based on a lifetime of observation, I think it would be incredibly naive to think that some women are not equally capable of being just as manipulative, vicious, violent, and coercively controlling as some men. And although from one perspective it seems reasonable to describe Moran as a self-confessed perpetrator of domestic violence who took responsibility for and apologised to the court for her actions, I suspect those who see her sex first and foremost before her actions may very well perceive her violence from the perspective of a victim acting in self-defence. That certainly was the position Patel and her Southall Black sisters took when they supported the case of a woman who, one night in 1979, went to her garage to get various ingredients, mixed herself a homemade napalm cocktail, and burnt her husband as he slept. The woman in question claimed to be a victim of extremely severe domestic violence, and interestingly, her life sentence was overturned because in her original trial, she was not advised of her right to ask the court to consider the lesser charge of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. I say interestingly because, as I mentioned earlier, that's a right that Layla Moran and at least 41 other lawmakers want to remove as an option in cases of domestic homicide. All of which brings me to my point about pansexuals and other members of the LGBT community, because despite the fact that people like Patel and Phillips insist that violence is gendered, ONS data shows that lesbian and bisexual women are between 2 and 3 times more likely to experience violence from their partner. And although they don't currently hold data on people who see people first and foremost before any possible sex, ONS data does show that 2 in every 3 perpetrators of violence against bisexual women are people of the same sex. So I guess that my point is that whether you personally choose to perceive people like Layla Moran as a perpetrator or victim, or even, as is very often the case, something somehow somewhere in between, people like Layla Moran and their partners have a right to expect equal treatment, an equal expectation of protection, and equal access to whatever type of specialist help they might at some point need. I guess my point is that people who push, and let's face it, police the gendered violence construct seem prepared to skew and ignore statistics that don't suit their preferred worldview, something which in turn will inevitably skew the policies and laws that are needed to deal with abuse, which in turn can help to push very damaging stereotypes or discriminatory restrictions around what our perception of a perpetrator or a victim should be. Surely it would be extremely dangerous not to reflect what is a social reality, what is a global reality proven time and time again. The reality that domestic violence is something that can happen to anyone, regardless of sex, sexuality, race, age, or creed. Surely a primary purpose of equality legislation is to protect minorities. And surely a primary purpose of equality legislation is to ensure that people like lawmakers and public service providers see people as people first and foremost, and do not discriminate against particular people just because they don't fit neatly into their personal or political worldview.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
The Glass Blind Spot is brought to you by you, because it's your views, your likes and your comments that keep this show on the road.